Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. Today's video, I'm going to take you through how to pattern and make your own gathered skirt with pockets. This skirt is a great beginner project. It teaches you how to do a lapped zipper, teaches you how to do gathers, how to attach a waistband, and best of all, how to insert inseam pockets. I'm going to walk you through how you can cut your own pieces of fabric for this project, but I've also attached a picture of the pocket pattern piece, since that's pretty much the same regardless of the size of your skirt. You need 3 basic shapes to create this skirt: a waistband, a large long rectangle that will be the base of the skirt, and your pockets. Just as an FYI, when you print out the pocket pattern piece, it does get cut off slightly at the bottom, so make sure you cut the curve fully to the edge of the paper instead of cutting it flat. I normally include a list of the amount of fabric you'll need for every project that I create a tutorial for, but given that this project can alter by the size of the wearer, it's a little bit difficult for me to give you an exact amount of fabric. Depending on the length and the size of your skirt, you're going to need anywhere from 1.5 yards to 3 yards of fabric. You are also going to need a 1/4 yard of interfacing, matching thread, and a matching zipper. I prefer a regular standard zipper, and mine was about 7 inches for this demonstration. Let's start by measuring our waist. My dress form's waist is 26.5 inches, so I'm going to add 1/2 inch of easing to that measurement, as well as 2 extra inches to finish off my waistband, creating a waistband length of 29 inches. Then I'm going to cut it to be 3 inches wide. That will finish us off with a 1 inch wide waistband. If you want a wider waistband, feel free to add on to the width of this measurement. After I finish cutting my waistband, I'm going to fold it in half widthwise, and I'm going to press that fold in place. While I'm pressing my waistband, let's talk a little bit about the measurements for the rectangle or body of the skirt. The first measurement you need is how long you want the skirt to be from your waist. Most people like to go to the knee, which is around 20 inches depending on your height. Add 2 inches to that measurement, and this will be the width of your rectangle. For demonstration's sake, mine's cut a little bit shorter so I can make sure that the rectangle will fit in the screen while I'm filming. Now we need to get a little bit of math involved. I want you to take your original waist measurement, mine was 26.5 inches, plus your easing, so 27 inches, and you're going to multiply that number by how full you want the skirt to be. The least amount of fullness would be multiplying by 2, which is what I'm doing for the video, again to make sure that my fabric fits in the screen. 27 multiplied by 2 is 54 inches. Now, luckily with gathered skirts, the measurements can be fairly forgiving, so if you're not spot on with your measurements, it'll probably work out okay. If you want more fullness to your skirt, you can multiply by 2.5, 3, 4, depending on how fluffy you want your skirt to be. Now I'm taking my fully cut rectangle and I'm ripping it in half widthwise. So you're going to end up with 2 rectangles that are the same length and the same width. Now I'm going to show you how to do this skirt with a back center zipper. You can also do this skirt with a side zipper. So if you're choosing the side zipper, you can skip the next step. But if you want to do the back zipper with me, you're going to then take one of your panels, you're going to mark it in the center again, and you're going to rip it in half. If your edges are a bit frayed after ripping the fabric, make sure you hit it with the iron or trim off any extra threads. After ripping the panel in half, you should have 1 large panel for the front and 2 equal-sized panels for the back. Now I'm going to move on to cutting the interfacing for my waistband. I take my waistband that's already been pressed, folded in half, and I place it on top of the interfacing, and I'm going to cut 1 long strip. I like to use the Pellon woven fusible interfacing because woven interfacing tends to lie in a garment much better than a normal non-woven would. Now that my fusible interfacing is cut, I'm going to open up my waistband and press it inside. Whenever you're using interfacing in a garment, you always want the piece of fabric that has the interfacing attached to be closest to your body. So in terms of our waistband here, that's folded in half, the inside fold will touch our body and the outside fold will be the outside of the garment. Your fused interfacing should never be fused to the piece of fabric that's on the outside of the garment. The last step in our prep work is to mark the little X's on all 4 of our pockets. There are many different ways that you can mark those X's on your pattern. You can use tailor chalk, a pin, a small snip in the seam, but the one thing you want to recommend against is using any type of permanent marking that may show on your final garment. Once you're done marking your pockets, take the front of your skirt and lay it flat on your ironing board with the right side facing up. Then take one piece of the pocket with the right side facing down and line up the outside edge. Place a couple pins to hold your pocket in place. Once you've got one piece of the pocket pinned to the right side of the front of the skirt, repeat this process on the left side of the front of the skirt. Next, we're going to attach each piece of the pocket bag by applying a 1/2 inch plain seam to each side of the skirt. You're going to stop that plain seam a 1/2 inch from the bottom. And then you're also going to perform an understitch on each side. If you aren't entirely sure what an understitch is, please feel free to watch my other video that's linked above on how to perform an understitch. But don't hop over to that sewing machine just yet. You're going to take the other two sides of your pocket bag and attach them to both sides of the back of the skirt. We're going to apply that plain seam just the same as the front pocket bags, as well as the understitching, to prepare to attach both sides of the skirts together and create the pocket. Here I'm demonstrating how to stitch on one of the pocket bags at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a stitch length of 3. Notice how I'm stopping a 1/2 inch before the edge of the pocket bag. I'm doing this for later for when we attach the two pocket bags together. Now on to our understitching. You're going to push your seam allowance towards the pocket bag. Then you're going to sew through all 3 layers, the 2 layers of your seam allowance and the pocket bag, between the 2 X's that we marked before. You're sewing at a regular seam length of 3, and you're going to sew no more than 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line you just created. One of the most important caveats I can make during understitching is to make sure that the fabric is nice and flat underneath the needle. If you let the pocket bag creep underneath your seam, you're going to end up with a puffy seam that really doesn't look very good. Understitching is a way to make sure that the seam that's on the inside of your garment rolls towards the inside. I'll point out how important this is later when we look at our finished skirt. Now that you've got all 4 pieces of your pocket bags attached to the body of the skirt, lay it back down on your ironing board or flat surface. Lay the front of the skirt facing upwards, and then you're going to lay both pieces of the back of the skirt on top of the front of the skirt, right sides touching each other. Go ahead and line up your pocket bags and pin them together. Once your pocket bags are successfully pinned together, you're going to sew around the entire curved edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a stitch length of 3. You're going to make sure that that seam ends up right at the edge of where you sewed the pocket bag together. This is why we left that 1/2 inch open at the end of sewing on the pocket bag. Take your time as you're sewing around the curve of the pocket bag so you can make sure that your seam allowance stays nice and even. And as you come around that curve, you want to make sure that you perfectly line up the seam of the pocket bag with the seam that's attaching it to the bodice of the skirt. If it's not lined up, you'll either have a hole or a pucker. See here? This is the end of the seam attaching my pocket bag to the body of the skirt. I'm going to make sure I sew directly to the end of that seam, backstitching when I'm done. Once your pocket bag is closed, by making sure that the seam from the pocket bag matches the seam from attaching the pocket bag to the body, push your 2 seam allowances back towards each other, and then you're going to place the exact spot where the pocket bag is finished being attached to the body of the skirt underneath your presser foot and continue stitching down the side seam of your skirt. It's very, very important that all 3 of these seams are perfectly lined up. If you don't line them up, you'll come up with holes or little puckers and bulges along the side of the seam where the pocket's attached to the skirt, and we don't want that. Complete sewing your side seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a stitch length of 3. Backstitch when you get to the bottom of the skirt. Before we move on to any other construction steps on our skirt, we're going to add a seam finish to the pocket bag as well as all the seams we've already sewn. I'm going to do this with a zigzag seam finish where I'm stitching the zigzag and having the left side hit the fabric and the right side wrap around the fabric. I've got a special video that you can click on above on how exactly to do a zigzag seam finish, but if you have a serger, that's absolutely acceptable to use in this situation as well. Here I am applying a seam finish to the side seam of my skirt. Just as an FYI, I did press open my side seam before applying the seam finish, even though I didn't show it. Don't worry, you're not getting away with no pressing on this project. Moving along to our zipper application. I'm going to instruct you on how to do a lapped zipper down the back center seam of this skirt. You can of course apply an invisible zipper or a centered zipper if you're more comfortable, but for this demonstration, I'm going to use a lapped zipper technique. I'm taking my 7-inch zipper and placing it along the back seam of my skirt. Using my tracing chalk, I'm marking where the bottom metal piece of my zipper would land. From the blue mark towards the bottom of the skirt, you're going to do a stitch length of 3. From the blue mark towards the top of the skirt, you're going to do a basting stitch, which is a stitch length of 5. And then you're going to press this open and you're going to seam finish both sides of the seam. Once your seam is pressed open, you can go ahead and use your seam ripper and take out your basting stitches. Now, I want to just stop here to say really quick, there's so many different techniques out there to do zippers, and I really recommend you do what works for you. This is the way I was taught, and I'm going to share that with you guys. But if you feel like you've learned it a different way and you like that way better, or you feel like this way just doesn't work for you, that's totally fine. You can go ahead and do your own type of zipper. Unless you're in my class, then yes, you have to do a lap zipper. Also take a moment before moving on to remove all of the loose threads from the undone basting stitch. There's nothing that makes a garment look home-sewn more than loose threads. Flip your skirt right side out. Then take your zipper tape and place the left side of the zipper tape underneath the open folded back left side of the center back seam. We're going to take that side of the open seam and press it right up against the zipper teeth. You're going to go ahead and pin that in place. Our goal when sewing the first side of the zipper is to sew that fold right up against the zipper teeth. Then when we sew the second side of the zipper, it will be folded or lapped over the zipper teeth. Since we need to sew our fabric right up against the side of the zipper teeth, I'm going to swap out my regular presser foot for a zipper presser foot. Like I've said in other videos, you can do any type of zipper without a zipper foot, but it certainly won't come out as clean as if you did it with a zipper foot. Before you start sewing, you want to take your zipper pull and pull it all the way down to the bottom of the zipper. Then place the zipper underneath the presser foot with the fabric right up against that edge of the teeth. From this angle, you can see just how close to the zipper teeth you're going to sew. That fabric should be laying right beside it, and you're going to use that zipper foot to get right against your zipper teeth. Now, as you move your way down the zipper, you're going to sink your needle and you're going to take your zipper pull and push it back up towards the top of the zipper. You don't want to sew around your zipper pull because if you do that, you're going to end up with a bubble in your zipper seam. Another thing that can cause some ugly little bubbles in our stitching is sewing over our pins. So as you make your way down the zipper, make sure you remove each pin before you stitch over it. Once you've reached the bottom of the zipper, you're going to backstitch and take your zipper out from underneath the sewing machine. Take the other side of the back seam and line it up with the side that we just sewed down. Now your fabric should be just lapping over the zipper teeth. You don't want to see any of the zipper once this side is sewn in place. I like to make sure I'm sewing just below the metal point of the zipper so I don't risk breaking a needle, but there are ways to shorten a zipper if the zipper you have is too long. Let's start by sewing across the bottom here. And then once we've sewn across the bottom, we're going to sink our needle and we're going to rotate and go towards the top of the zipper. Just a reminder, we don't want to sew over any pins because that'll give us some little warbles in our stitching that won't be so pretty. And then about halfway up our zipper, you're going to take the zipper stop and you're going to pull it past your presser foot. Again, so you don't get any weird bubbles or bumps in your stitching. Here's our completed lapped zipper. You should be able to open and close your zipper with absolutely no snagging or pulling. To prepare for our gathers, we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches from the center back seam or the zipper out to the side seam. Then we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches from the center front of the garment out to our pockets. To sew a basting stitch, we're setting our machine to a straight stitch. We're keeping the width at 0 and we're turning the length all the way up as high as it can go. The 2 most important things to remember when sewing a basting stitch for gathering is to 1, not backstitch, and 2, make sure you leave the tails of your thread. Do not cut your thread too short or your basting stitches will not work to gather your skirt. When I'm sewing the second row of basting stitch, I keep the first row right inside the little hole of the presser foot to make sure I'm not too far or too close to that first row of basting. The reason we sew 2 rows of basting is because it creates a nicer, tighter gather in the end. You could sew just one, but I really feel it won't come out as good in the end. And see here, these are my tails. I want to make sure I have plenty of tail left on every basting stitch I sew. I'm going to pull my gathers from the side seams towards the center, which means I have to take the center tails and knot them all together. The reason we knot one end is so that way when we pull from the other end, the gathers don't come undone. On the end that's going to be the knotted end and not the pulling end, I'm knotting together all 4 of my loose threads. Trust me on this one, you don't want to skimp on your knots. If you don't tie them tight enough, then they're going to come undone, and when you go to pull your basting stitches, the entire basting stitch will come out of your garment, and then you'll have to do it again. Now let's turn to the ends that we're going to be pulling from. You're going to pick one side of threads to pull from, and then one side that you're going to tie a knot in. So for me, I'm taking my outside threads to use as my pullers and my inside threads that I'm going to knot. While you're creating your gathering stitches, it's very important to make sure you keep all of those extra tails organized. You can very easily get disorganized with flying threads and not be sure what's a pulling thread and what's a knotted thread. So just make sure as you go, you don't have any extraneous threads to confuse you and you keep them nice and neat. Usually once I've securely knotted 2 threads, I'll clip it down so I know it's clearly not my pulling threads anymore, but if you're new to this, I recommend not clipping them down all the way because if they come unknotted, then it's a lot harder to go ahead and retie them. I flipped the skirt over and we're going to repeat the steps that we just did on the back with the front of the skirt. I am going to tie all 4 of my tails in the center front together to create one knot, and then I'll use my side tails as my pulling threads. The reason I'm tying them all together at the center front is to make sure I don't have any kind of gap or bald spot right in the center front of my skirt. Our goal is for our gathers to be continuous all the way around from the zipper in the center back through the front of the skirt and then back towards the back again. Here I'm going to give you a little sneak peek at how gathering works. You're going to take those 2 pulling threads and you're going to pull them very gently, and you can scooch, scooch, scooch in your gathers and the fabric will gather together. You don't have to do this a lot right now because we're going to do this with the waistband attached so we know just how much gathering we need to achieve. For right now, make sure you finish up your knotting on both outside seams of the skirt. As you can see here, I knot my threads at least 4 times so I make sure that knot really isn't going anywhere. Let's now place a few important marks on our waistband with our tailor chalk. I'm going to measure in 1 inch from each end of the waistband. This is our little bit of extra that's going to lap over the zipper in the back to give us enough room to put the hook and eye. Next, let's fold our waistband in half so that way we can accurately mark the center front of our waistband. Then I'm going to take the center front mark that I just made and I'm going to fold that over to the marks that I made that are 1 inch over from the end of the waistband. So not entirely over to the end. I'm going to mark that fold on both sides of the waistband. That is our side seam. When I make marks like this, I'm making them down at the rough edge of the fabric, not at the folded edge, because you don't want to accidentally have any blue tailor chalk showing on your final garment, and these marks will end up inside a seam allowance. Grab your pins so we can pin our waistband to our skirt. We're going to take the non-interface side and pin that to the body of the skirt, starting with the center front. Hopefully you remember what I said about interfacing before, that interfacing always touches the inside of the body. So we want our outside of our waistband to be attached to the skirt, the non-interface side, so that way the interface side flips over towards the inside of the skirt. After the center front, I'm going to work my way to the right and find my next blue mark. That blue mark is going to line up with the side seam of the skirt. Now, I go ahead and pin the pockets together because we're going to end up sewing over the pocket to keep it together, not having the pocket open and spread wide. If it's spread wide, it's not going to fit right into the waistband. You should notice at this point as you're pinning that you have significantly more skirt fabric than you do waistband fabric. That's totally normal. That's because after we're done pinning, we're going to use that scooching technique or the gathering, and we're going to gather that fabric into the waistband. Moving along to the back of the skirt, find that 1-inch mark we made at the very end of the waistband. You're going to take that 1-inch mark and line it up with the very edge of the fold that's just above the zipper tape in the center back, and you're going to pin it there. Same thing with the back as the front. You're going to have a lot of extra fabric versus waistband fabric. Complete this step with the other side, and now your waistband should be completely pinned in place. Now it's time to scooch in our fabric. I want to explain here why I break it down into 4 quadrants across the skirt instead of just doing 2 long basting stitches around the entire skirt. I do this so it's much more manageable. If you try to do a gathering stitch on a very long basting stitch, somewhere along the way your thread might break, and then you have to do the whole thing over again. So I break it into fourths to make it a lot easier to scooch in each section and to even it out to make your gathers nice and neat. So you can see here, I'm pulling with my pull threads, and I'm going to pull until the skirt fabric is scrunched in enough to be even with my waistband. Don't be discouraged if you break a thread the first time or if this is a little tricky for you the first time. Gathering is a fairly advanced technique, and it does take a little bit of practice and a little bit of finesse to get it really well done. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull in the skirt fabric as much as it needs to be pulled in. And then I go back and I even out the gathers because we don't want our gathers all bunched in one place and then bald spots or spots where there are no gathers otherwhere in the skirt. Again, the goal is to have even, beautiful gathers all the way around the skirt. See how right now my gathers look kind of puffy and unorganized? The way I fix that is I take the top of the gathering where the basting stitch is and I pull downwards with the fabric, and that helps it lay a little bit more flat and helps me see better if I need to move some gathers over or fix a bald spot. Once I've got them pulled down flat and I know exactly where I want my gather to be, I'm going to start pinning it in place. So as you can see here, I'm going to put some pins in. I don't want any big puckers or giant chunks of gather. Everything wants to be nice and even, and you can use as many pins as you want. If you need to use 200 pins to hold those gathers in place exactly where you want them, please go ahead and do that. Just be careful about sewing over them once you head over to the machine. Make sure you take your time with this part. Given that the gathers are the central feature of this skirt, you want to make sure your gathers, again, are nice and even, are tiny, are no big old chunkers. You don't want big folds that look like pleats from the front. So again, go over those gathers, make sure they're beautiful and even before you move on to the next section. See here? This is what happens when one of your knots comes undone. You can't pull your basting stitches, so super important that you make sure all those knots are done nice and tight. At this point, I've gathered all 4 quadrants of my skirt and I've got them pinned in place to the waistband. Now let's talk about the top of those pocket bags. Once you've got your front gathers gathered and attached to the waistband, you can lay the top of your pocket bag down on top of the gathers. This is why you want to make sure those gathers are exactly where you want them to be before you lay down your pocket, because you're going to sew over that part. Alrighty, it's time to sew our skirt onto the waistband. I like to sew with my gathers facing up so that way I can make sure I remove any pins as I go, and I can also adjust any weird looking big chunks of the gathers with my fingers. Our seam allowance is still going to be 1/2 inch, and our stitch length is going to be a stitch length of 3. So if you just sewed your basting stitches, double check that you went back to a stitch length of 3. That's a very common mistake. And then you'd have to do it all over again, which you don't want. Once I get to my pocket, I'm going to lift the pocket up and take out any of the pins that are holding in the gathers and give it one last check to make sure all the gathers are exactly where I want them to be. Because you're going to kind of be sewing blind here. You're going to sew over that pocket and your gathers are going to get sandwiched between the pocket and the waistband. Continue sewing your gathers onto your waistband until you've reached the end of the waistband or the center back zipper. As you go, again, keep adjusting your gathers. Make sure you don't have any chunks or large pleats that will upset the continuality of your gathers as they go around the skirt. Now that your waistband has been successfully attached, we need to finish off the ends of our waistband. So I'm going to fold the waistband inside out with the interfacing side facing me. On one side of my waistband, I'm going to sew just a 1/4 inch from the end of the waistband. This is going to create a tab for our hook at the very end. On the other side, I'm going to sew just in line with the end of where the fabric is, so that way there's no hangover on the waistband. Here I'm demonstrating on the second side where I'm lining up where I'm going to sew with the edge of the fabric that's lapped over the zipper. Once the waistband end is sewn closed, I clip off the excess fabric and I flip it right side out, creating a very lovely finished edge to our waistband. Next, let's get our iron. We're going to apply some gentle heat and pressure to our gathers. You don't want to crush them because then they're going to lose all their pretty fluffiness. But we do want to press that seam down and flat that we just created by sewing on the waistband. So you can't really see it here. It's a little tough to see from my angle, but I'm just very gently applying some heat to those gathers, and I'm making sure that my waistband is pressed nice and flat. At this point, you can actually see how our pocket is going to be functionally part of the skirt. Then, when we look inside the waistband, we want to make sure that our interfacing is on the inside and that we're pressing the waistband down with the bottom 1/2 inch folded upward to prepare for our slip stitch. To finish off the inside of our waistband, we're going to take that 1/2 inch extra seam allowance and fold it upward and inward. We're also going to make sure that our seam allowance that includes the gathering is tucked up inside the waistband. Our goal is to make the inside of our garment always look as nice as the outside of our garment. I'm going to go all the way around the inside of the waistband, folding up that extra 1/2 inch, tucking in my gathers, and pinning it in place. I'm doing this to prepare for a slip stitch. Now that we've reached the other side of the skirt, you can see how I have a small 1/2 inch tab hanging over the zipper. That's going to help us with our hook and eye in a moment. And if it's not quite fully pointy from flipping it inside out, I use a pair of scissors just to gently make sure that point is nice and sharp. Now that you're ready to slip stitch, I'm going to flip the skirt right side over, and I like to hold the skirt in my left hand and perform the slip stitch with my right hand. You do this with a hand sewing needle. I'm not going to go fully in depth on how to do a slip stitch in this video, since I do have a separate video on how to complete a slip stitch, but this is essentially the tunnel and bite technique, where you take a little slice of the tunnel, slide your needle through, and then you take a bite of the fabric that's beneath it. Tunnel, bite, tunnel, bite. Again, your goal is to have as little thread showing as possible, so that way the inside looks very neat and clean. You're going to continue your slip stitch all the way around the entire inside of the waistband. If at any point in time your sewing needle runs out of thread, just knot it and start it again. A really good rule of thumb when you're doing hand sewing is to never have more thread than your arm length. If you have more thread than your arm length, it tends to get really tangled and you're just going to end up with a frustrating mess. The great news is after this, we only have 2 steps left. I'm going to use a silver pants hook and eye at the top of our zipper as a closure. You always want to have a closure at the top of your zipper to avoid it from slipping downward. I'm placing the bar side on the side of the waistband that has a tab. That's going to end up on the underneath. So when we look at the outside of our skirt, the edge of the waistband is flush with the edge of the zipper. I'm using a hand sewing needle and I'm going to loop my thread through each of these holes 3 or 4 times. I'm going to go a little bit quick through this, but if you need further instruction on how to attach a pants hook and eye, I've got another video that you can click above to slow this part down a bit and get some really in-depth instruction on how to properly sew on a pants hook and eye. I've already sewed on the hook part on the inside of the waistband off screen, and now that they're both sewed on, we've got a beautiful closure for our skirt. Our last step of the skirt is to do a hem along the bottom. Now again, lots of different ways that you can do a hem. You could fold it up 1.5 inches and do a slip stitch, but what I'm going to do for the sake of time is show you how to do a rolled hem, which is where you fold it up about 1/4 inch on each fold twice, and then you stitch right along the top of the fold. Now, a slip stitch hem will not be shown from the outside, versus a rolled hem, you will see it from the outside. So it really depends on what type of look you're going for. If it's a more elegant evening skirt, I would definitely go with the slip stitch. If it's just like a fun skirt for daytime or for Halloween, a rolled hem will do just fine. So what you can see I'm doing here is I'm going around the entire hem of the skirt and I'm pressing my rolled hem in place before I go over to the sewing machine. This ensures that my rolled hem is nice and even, and it'll be a very, very clean sew, and I won't have to worry about measuring as I sew. Once I'm over at the sewing machine, I'm stitching with a regular stitch, a stitch length of 3, and I'm gonna make sure my stitches are right along that fold line. I don't wanna sew halfway between the fold and the edge of the skirt, because then you get some weird flappiness on the inside of your skirt that, again, it just doesn't look nice. You wanna make sure that that hem is securely held in place. I've got one final little accent step that I decided to add on at the end. I accidentally cut a waistband too short at the start, so I decided to take that waistband fabric and I sewed it into a tube and flipped it right side out to create a bow. I tied the bow together, and then I'm just using a whip stitch to sew it in place on the waistband. You know, nice little accent, and then no fabric goes to waste. Congratulations, we've made it to the end of our skirt. Here's what our skirt looks like from the back. And here's our zipper that we can pull down with ease. Please ignore Noodles photobombing during this part. He just had to be sitting right there while I was filming. You can see from the back of the skirt, we've got some lovely gathers that go evenly around. They are a bit on the chunkier side, so if you wanted tighter ones, you could do 3 rows of basting stitches. And we've got our functional pockets on the side. Remember when I was talking at the beginning that if you want more fullness and more gathers, you could also add more fabric to that initial rectangle. And looking at our skirt from the front, we can see how our gathers again go evenly all the way around. We have no blank spot in the center front. We've got our cute little bow on the side, and we've got a really great skirt for any type of summer event. It's important to note as well that now that you've been through the steps to create a gathered skirt, you can alter this design to whatever your need might be. You can make it longer, you can make it fuller, you can take the pockets out. You can really make this skirt any type of skirt you would like it to be. And that's it for my tutorial on how to make a gathered skirt from your own measurements. Thanks again for stopping by my channel, Meghan Grace DIY. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please feel free to check out other tutorials on my channel. And if you really enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe and notify button. And if you want more information on general crafting and things I'm up to, please feel free to follow me on Facebook, Pinterest, or Instagram. As always, if you have any questions or any types of tutorials you're looking for, please feel free to put them in the comments section below. And as always, happy sewing!